And we're going to be talking about Israel in the wilderness, their time of wilderness wanderings. I want to give this map. Hopefully you can see this. The writing might be kind of small, but it at least traces the route, the potential route that the children of Israel may have taken as they left Egypt. So Egypt up to the top left corner, then they make their way. It's about a 2-month trip till they get down to Mount Sinai, which is at the southernmost part of the Sinai Peninsula. So it took them a couple of months to make their way there. And they're at Mount Sinai for about a year. So just about a little over a year has taken place since they traveled across the Red Sea, or Moses parted the waters and they crossed the Red Sea and made their exodus, their escape out of Egypt. And as they are at Mount Sinai, well, I'll give this next chart, which is kind of just a simple timeline of these events. A couple of months on their travel, they're at Sinai for about a year, and then we see they're in the wilderness for 40 years. Now, looking at the Old Testament passages, we see that this period where they're traveling up until they're getting ready to leave Mount Sinai covers all the way from Exodus chapter 12 until Numbers chapter 10. So quite a bit is happening within that a little over a year, give or take a couple of months. And then we see that there's 40 years that they wander. Now what's interesting is you've got so much recorded about this 14-month period, but then as we get into the 40 years in the wilderness, there's very little of those events that are recorded for us. So a little bit ironic that more time has elapsed, but less events are recorded. But I want to go back to the event that it takes place at Kadesh Barnea. Nathan did an awesome job covering that topic, and I'll just be giving an overview of it. I went back and listened to his talk. Thankful for Aaron putting those on YouTube, and it's nice because you can kind of close the office door and listen to it without a lot of child interaction, so you're able to kind of glean a little bit more than maybe you did in the while you're in the audience. But I wanted to just rehash this story that takes place in Numbers 13 and 14 because it is the springboard for what we are going to be looking at in the wilderness. So here what we see in Numbers chapter 13 is that God is ready to fulfill the land promise. The land promise, of course, being one of the promises that he made to Abraham back in the book of Genesis. So he's ready to give them the land of Canaan. And so we see what happens is they camp at Kadesh Barnea. It's just simply an area you might think of as the staging area for the advance they're about to make on the land of Canaan. And they're camped there for 40 days. And what they're waiting on is for these 12 spies that they've sent out to spy out the land. They're waiting for them to return, and they're gone for 40 days. And so we see that they're waiting for them to come back and give a report of that, of what they've witnessed. And so they leave. The spies end up coming back. The 12 spies come back, and they're giving their report of what they've seen. And they're talking about the land. It truly is a land flowing with milk and honey. A couple of them come back carrying a stick that's weighted down in the middle with a huge cluster of grapes, just to show the proof of the prosperity that's in the land, that it's going to be great for agriculture. But then they also report that there's a lot of people within the land that are going to be tough to overcome. There's a lot of armies, well fortified cities, a lot of strong places there that are going to be very, very difficult to overcome. And 10 out of the 12 spies are very, very afraid for what is about to take place, and they kind of steer the people clear of this this campaign to take over Canaan. Meanwhile, you've got Joshua and Caleb, two of the other spies, that they looked at it from a completely different perspective. They looked at it through the perspective that they had the strength of God with them. We can take over this land, and I think now's the time to strike. And so they encouraged them to go in and take the land right on the day that the spies return. But we see the people refuse to take the land. They instead listened to the advice of the 10 spies that said, I don't think we should do this. It's going to be a failed effort. And so the people kind of side with them. But what's interesting is, as we pointed out, it's only been a year since they left Egypt, since they witnessed the miracle that took place of the parting of the Red Sea. They had witnessed the 10 plagues that God had brought upon Egypt. They had witnessed all of these miraculous events. And, it's, as I think about it, they could have been sitting around on this 40th day waiting for the spies to come back, sitting around drinking their coffee and reminiscing about, what all God had brought them through. And it, as we often talk about, can you believe it's been a year since this happened? Or, the pandemic's been going on for a couple of years now. It's hard to believe that. Well, I imagine them just kind of sitting around talking about these things and reminiscing and thinking about what God had brought them through from the bondage of Egypt. But then as these spies happen to return, they're all of a sudden confronted with the goal ahead of them and a huge obstacle in the way. And they don't even think about the strength of God that's got them there. They instead think about the obstacle that lies ahead. And so it's very interesting, still the mindset of the people when they refuse to follow God's command to take over Canaan. And we see that as a result, God punishes them. 10 of the 10 spies that were very discouraging in their news, they are killed basically on sight. They die of a plague right before the people. And then God condemns the people to wander the wilderness for 40 years. And everyone 20 years old and above will die in the wilderness. They won't get to see the land of Canaan. And so this is the judgment that God passes on them. And we see, that they end up, of course, they're mourning when Moses brings the news to them. He has nothing but bad news to bring. And so they mourn at hearing about this punishment. And what they try to do instead is they try to take over the land of Canaan. It's pretty similar to when you're trying to tell your kid what to do. If it's go clean their room and you've told them a number of times and they continually refuse to the point that you're ready to exact punishment on them, bring out the paddle, and as soon as you have made your threats, eventually you end up deciding to follow through with it. And as soon as you bring the paddle their way, they ultimately decide, I'll clean my room now. That's basically kind of the impression that I get of this group of people. They've been shown so many miraculous things. God has shown them his miraculous strength. They refuse to take over the land. And then once they hear their punishment, all of a sudden they're wanting to be obedient. And so they try to take over the land of Canaan themselves. But Moses reminds them, he says, God's not going to be with you. If you try to follow through with this, it's going to be a failed attempt because you had your chance. God has brought his punishment upon you, and you're trying to now go beyond his commands again. He says he's not going to be with you. And we see what happens is they suffered defeat against the Amalekites and the Canaanites, and they were driven all the way to a town called Hormah. And we'll point that out on the map because we'll mention it again a little bit later. But we can see Kadesh Barnea up kind of toward the top right, and then above that is the town of Hormah where they're driven to. And so they've suffered a big defeat here, but God does provide them a little bit of encouragement. He says, when you take the land. So he's showing them a small glimmer of hope. He's, instead of, kind of the father that might step in and provide further correction and instruction, which he does, but he instead, takes the approach as well to be, showing them a little bit of a glimmer of hope if they will follow his commands. So we see that they're banished to wander in the wilderness. And ultimately what they're doing here is simply waiting for a generation to die. Everyone who's 20 years old and above is going to die in the wilderness. They'll never see the promised land. And so they're simply just kind of wandering around in the desert waiting for a generation to die. We also see that they lived as shepherds. And also, as I mentioned, there's no record of most of the events that take place during this wilderness period. But we do have a few recorded, and they're focal point events for Israel. And so we'll notice a few of these. I won't be spending a lot of time on each of these, but this first one is probably where we will spend the majority of our time. We won't have any passages to read. We'll be relying on my storytelling skills, which aren't that great, but hopefully we'll be able to glean a lot from it. But we're going to talk first about what we find recorded in Numbers 16 about the rebellion of Cora, Dathan, and Byram. So we don't know exactly when this event takes place after the event we just looked at Kadesh Barnea. But this is sometime into their 40-year wilderness wandering period. A lot of these events we'll look at take place toward the end of that period. But we don't know exactly where this one falls. But we see these three individuals, Cora, Dathan, and Byram. These are three individuals who decide to challenge Moses and Aaron on their leadership. This was kind of the first big challenge that Moses and Aaron faced regarding their leadership over the children of Israel. And just to give a little bit of background, which is pertinent for the story, Cora, he's from the tribe of Levi, which we know Levi was the one of the 12 tribes that it was actually the one that God had chosen to fulfill a lot of the priestly ministry and tending to the tabernacle and things. So Levi was given a prominent place among the tribes. And then we've got Dathan and Abiram, who are from the tribe of Reuben. And so what we have here are three individuals that have teamed up, and there's a lot of people that have teamed up with them to challenge Moses and Aaron. And what they're challenging is that Cora says that Aaron and his sons, who are of the tribe of Levi, the priesthood has been granted to them. God has specially chosen Aaron and his descendants to be the priests for the children of Israel. And the rest of the Levites are kind of given subordinate roles within the tending to the tabernacle. But what Cora is challenging is that all of Levi should have an option to be involved with the priesthood. It shouldn't just be Aaron and his descendants. And then with Dathan and Abiram, they're of the tribe of Reuben. Reuben, you might recall, was the eldest son of Jacob, and they felt like they had more of a say in who should be the priest. They should be the priest since they are of the firstborn tribe, and so they're challenging the leadership as well. So it's interesting that they team up where these Reubenites are basically even challenging that Levi should have the priesthood. But I guess when you're trying to form a rebellion, you'll take as many recruits as you can get. And so Korah's kind of leading it all. He recruits Dathan and Abiram as well. And also what we see is there's about 250 princes, so 250 other individuals that join Cora in this rebellion. And so this whole matter is brought before Moses and Aaron. And Moses has to decide how to handle this issue. And so he decides to meet individually with Cora, and he proposes a challenge. He says, what you're going to do is offer incense before God. And whoever can offer incense, Aaron or Cora, whoever is not swallowed up and consumed by the fire of God, is going to be evident that they're the ones that are chosen to be the priest. And so he then speaks with the whole tribe of Levi. Moses speaks with Levi, and he makes them aware. He reminds them that God has chosen them for a special work, and that to challenge Aaron is to challenge God. They've got a special role to play, but God has chosen Aaron for the priesthood, he and his descendants. And so to challenge Aaron is essentially to challenge God. And also what Moses is trying to do is kind of divide this rebellion. He's trying to find out who the most guilty party is, and he's also trying to separate these individuals along the way. He then tries to meet with the Reubenites. He tries to meet with Dathan and Abiram. They refuse to meet with him, and they bring a lot of accusations against Moses. They tell Moses, well, you're the whole reason that we left a land flowing with milk and honey. We left Egypt where we had plenty of food to eat, and now we're out here in the desert eating manna. We had it good there. And also, you haven't fulfilled your promise, Moses, about leading us into the promised land. And so they hurl a lot of accusations at Moses. And so Moses ultimately gets fed up with all of this. And I think for the first time recorded in the Bible, it says that Moses was angry. He was angry with the people. And he actually prayed to God that he would not receive the offering of incense that was about to take place. So what we have here is Cora and his followers are at the tabernacle. They've filled their censers with incense, and they are ready to offer their offering before God. Meanwhile, in the camp, we've got Dathan and Byram who are at their tents, and they've got all of their followers kind of surrounding them. And so we've got kind of two different camps you can think of, two different situations. But the test for Cora, again, is that if their incense is not acceptable before God, they're going to be consumed with godly fire. The test for Dathan and Byram and all who are with them is that if God approves of, or if God doesn't approve of them, they're going to be swallowed up by the earth. And so, as this all proceeds, and ultimately what I should say is that God was ready to destroy everyone. He was ready to destroy the entire camp. And he said, I can do all this, and Moses, I can raise up a nation from you. But Moses and Aaron both pleaded with God that he wouldn't do that. And so we see that as these events take place, Cora and his followers end up offering that incense, and you probably know the rest of the story, that they are consumed with godly fire. And then meanwhile we have Dathan and Abiram, and everyone around them is warned to separate themselves away from the tents of Dathan and Abiram. And what ends up happening is, of course, the earth opens up, it swallows up Dathan, Abiram, all of their family, everyone that has still sided with them, and then the earth closes up and covers them up. And so we have this great rebellion that takes place, and a challenge to Moses and Aaron's authority, and a challenge towards God as well. The people try to test God and who he's chosen in his leadership. And so the rebellion of Cora, Dathan, and Abiram, we'll talk about this a little bit further. We'll talk about some of the other events, but this is a very important event that happens within the wilderness. And, to top it off, immediately following this event, immediately the very next day, what we find is that the children of Israel end up complaining against Moses and Aaron. And they basically said, you're the reason that those guys got killed. You are the culprits. You're the reason why this calamity has happened. And this infuriates God to the point that he sends a plague out before the people. And had Moses and Aaron not intervened, it would have killed the entire camp of Israel. But what we see is Aaron's most finest hour. This is the story that Jerry Dickinson, he records in one of the best sermons I think that he's ever given. Talking about between the living and the dead, as the plague spreads throughout the camp, we see Aaron running through the camp, through the middle of the camp, with his censer offering before God. And as he runs through the middle of the camp, he literally is running between the living and the dead to stop this plague from spreading throughout the rest of the camp. And it's estimated that close to 15,000 Israelites died because of that, but of course it could have been a lot more had Aaron not intervened for the people. And so we see that even just immediately following on the heels of a rebellion of Cora, Dathan, and Abiram, we see the people then complaining immediately the very next day and being punished for it. Then we see Aaron's authority is confirmed. That's in Numbers chapter 17. Just very quickly on that story, God wants to confirm that Aaron is the true priest of Israel. And he does this through a sign that one individual from every tribe is supposed to write their name, inscribe their name on a stick. And whoever stick buds is going to be the one that God has chosen. And so we find out that the very next day, Aaron's stick is the one that is budded. Not only that, it grows almonds on it. And so this is another sign to show that this is who God has selected to be priest over Israel. So that's a very key event in the book of Numbers. We also see the death of Miriam, who was the sister of Moses and Aaron. You might remember that Miriam was the one who, when Moses was a baby and who was put by his mother into the river in order to save his life, Miriam was the one who followed along the stream beside Moses as he floated down the stream to watch over him. And whenever the daughter of Pharaoh found Moses, it was it was Miriam who intervened and said that she would find a Hebrew woman in order to nourish and raise Moses. And of course, she brought him back to their very own mother. And so it was Miriam who was a very pivotal character, important character in the life of Moses, not just at that point, but also as we see recorded throughout the first few books of the Old Testament. So we see the death of Miriam that happens in the wilderness. Then we see that Moses strikes the rock for water. This is a story that I'll just briefly give a couple of points on. But the children of Israel, of course, they continually weigh on Moses. They try his patience. And they come to a point where they're needing water. And it's recorded there that there's a rock in the region, and it just says the rock. So it had to have been, one of the only big boulders there in the region. And we see that God commands Moses to speak to the rock in order for the water to flow forth from it so that they'll have plenty of water to drink. And Moses ends up striking the rock twice. Instead of speaking to the rock once, he strikes the rock twice and does not follow the commands of God. And God has a punishment for Moses as well, as we'll notice. And as we've already noticed, there was punishment already for Israel, for those who rebelled. Moses is no different in this respect. We see that even though he's the leader of Israel, we see that him not following God's commands caused him to have a punishment as well. And his punishment was that he would never get to enter into the land of Canaan. He'd never get to enter into the promised land. He could lead the children of Israel to it, but he himself would not get to enter in. Another event that we see is the death of Aaron in Numbers chapter 20. And then we see that Eleazar, one of his sons, is appointed to be high priest in his place. Aaron, of course, it can't be understated the important role that he played in the life of Moses and in the lives of the children of Israel at this time. And so Aaron passing is a central figure for Moses, a very important figure for him. And then just a point that I want to make as far as the sons of Aaron, what we have recorded in Leviticus chapter 10 is 2 of Aaron's sons were actually consumed by fire. We just talked about this story and those being consumed by fire, but even Aaron's own sons were not spared from that when they offered strange fire. Nadab and Abihu were their names. But they offered strange fire to God in Leviticus chapter 10, and they were consumed by the fire of God. But we see that Aaron has another son, Eleazar, who's appointed. Then we see things begin to shift a little bit for the children of Israel. They've undergone a lot of tough lessons, you might say. But we see as they're traveling along the road, there's a king named Arad, who is king of the Canaanites. And as they're traveling along the road, King Arad and his forces attack the children of Israel. He takes some of them captive. And then we see that the children of Israel actually, at this point, turn to God. I think it's interesting, something you might potentially read over. But one interesting point is that they actually turned to God and they said, if you will deliver these individuals to our hands, we will completely clear out the entire land of these individuals. And so we see that God does meet their request, and they're granted a great victory there at Hormah against King Arad. And you might recall that Hormah was the region where, when they tried to take matters into their own hands, at their failure of Kadesh Barnea, they were driven all the way up to Hormah. And so what was once the area where they suffered a great defeat, they now start to gain a little bit of a victory here at this region. Then we see that, unfortunately, they complain some more. They complain that they don't have enough food and water to drink. God has brought manna from heaven. They're wandering through a desert, and to think about any kind of a food source, especially for the number of people that are traveling through there, to have food literally falling from the sky was a miracle. And certainly probably the first few days that happened, it was a miracle for them. But what was once a miracle quickly becomes the expectation and quickly is overlooked. And so the people complain that they don't have enough food and enough water to drink. And so God is infuriated by their complaints, and he then sends out poisonous snakes among the camp. And many people are bitten and many people die because of this. I don't know exactly how many were killed because of this, but Instead of God taking away this plague, one commentator pointed this out. It's interesting that instead of taking away this plague, God gives a solution to it. And that's that Moses creates this bronze serpent so that whoever looks upon it, if they've been bitten by a venomous snake, if they look upon that bronze serpent, they'll be cured of it. And so we see this, and Jesus even references this in relation to his ministry later on in the New Testament as being, kind of the parallel example of the cure for sin and bringing about salvation for humanity. But unfortunately, we see these individuals, they're punished again because of their complaining, but thankfully there's a solution for them. Then we see that they have another victory against Sihon, who is the Amorite king. You might recall that it was the Canaanites and the Amorites who had defeated them at Hormah, and now they've already defeated King Arad and the Canaanites. Now they have the opportunity to defeat Sihon. The whole reason that this even came up is that as they were traveling through the region, they were trying to travel through Moab, and it would have made their travel a lot easier, a lot smoother. But Sihon, who's king of that area, didn't listen to their pleas. He wouldn't allow them to pass through. And so they end up getting attacked by Sihon, but they have a victory against him. And this was, as one commentator said, this was a great pivotal event. It was a great confidence booster for the people. And we see that these victories start to stack up. There's another victory that they have recorded there shortly thereafter, the victory against Og. And Og was the king of Bashan, but one interesting fact about him is he was literally a giant. He was a giant king. It has recorded there that his bed was 13 and a half feet long by 6 feet wide. And so that shows you just exactly how large of a figure this was. And so this was another confidence booster for the people to have this victory over Og and his forces in the wilderness. And so these are some of the major events that take place within the wilderness. We'll analyze just a few and make some points. But we can see that as the children of Israel, on the previous slide that we looked at, they had a lot of failures, a lot of complaining. They challenged their leadership, and they were punished for it. But then we see here that the tide begins to turn. They begin to trust in God more. They know that God's going to be the source of their victory and strength. And we see that because of that, they're blessed. And so some key points. The people were tested at Kadesh Barnea. Moses himself was tested. I pointed that out. I think I pointed it out for this story, but I actually should have applied to Kadesh Barnea. Moses was tested because this is where God told him that I just want to annihilate this entire group of people and I'll raise up a nation from you. So Moses was tested, but instead Moses pleads with God to have mercy on the people and to be able to allow them to continue their progress. The people also test God's patience. In Numbers 14 and 22, he says, "These 10 times you have tested me." I don't know all of the other times necessarily that they had tested God's patience, but they had tested God multiple times. And we also see that there were consequences because of their disobedience. They didn't pass the test at Kadesh Barnea, and they suffered a great defeat there, and also suffered a lot of consequences, wandering the wilderness for 40 years being the chiefest among those. And what's interesting too, as I reflect on this, that could have been the pivotal point for the people at Kadesh Barnea. You know, they could have had the opportunity to immediately, after the spies came back, they could have immediately attacked the land and seized the promised land to claim it for themselves. But instead, that was delayed for 40 years because of their disobedience. So just thought I'd point that out. And then we pointed out the rebellion of Cora, Dathan, and Byram and the consequences there. The thing I want to point out with this is that it wasn't just them that suffered the consequences, but it was all the individuals associated with them. It was all of their children, all of their descendants. They also suffered in this rebellion and were the ones siding with Cora were consumed. The ones with Dathan and Abiram were consumed by the earth. Then we see the people complain against Moses and Aaron in number 16 and consequences there. So we can see all across the board there were the one thing that they could count on if they disobeyed God was that there were going to be great consequences as a result. And then there's this whole idea of God testing them. And I want to make some points and applications as far as this goes. God had tested the people a number of times in the wilderness. And one thing that God's testing revealed was their attitude towards Him, their loyalty towards Him, and the level of faith that they had in God. And there were times that they did not rise to the occasion, and they didn't have the attitude that they should, or the loyalty to God, or the faith in Him, who had led them through so many victories before and led them out of Egypt. God's testing also is important because it highlights the foolishness of man's wisdom. You know, we pointed out it immediately following Kadesh Barnea, they tried to take matters into their own hands, but God wasn't with them. That was a foolish act, and there's numbers of occasions. And as we reflect on the Old Testament and the things we've studied so far, we see a repeat of a lot of these things. If you think back to the Tower of Babel, how man tried to rely on his own wisdom to build a tower to the heavens, and God punished them there and confused their language. You know, we can find so many opportunities where history repeats itself in the Old Testament when man tries to rely on his own wisdom. And also the importance of God testing is that it points to His strength and His perfect way. Its whole goal is to lead the individual to God's strength, to His power, to Him being the source of their salvation. And this is also a passing and a failing. You know, as we think about going to school and taking a test, you know, there's different grades that we get, A, B, C, D, F. Further on into my education, they actually removed the D, and you can only get A, B, C, F. Then as I got ready to take the licensing exam for pharmacy, it was a pass or fail. You either passed it and were able to get your license, or you failed. And the same is true for us as Christians, and the same was true for them. And the passing versus failing, it all relied on their level of obedience to God. And God required 100% obedience. You know, we see that time and again with the people. When they fail to keep the law in one area, they're guilty of the entire law. But God required complete obedience. And if they passed the test, if they showed their obedience, there were blessings. And we noticed that in some of those stories. And if they failed, there would be correction and consequences. And the same is true for us today. God requires us to be obedient to His will, and whenever we don't, we know that we're going to suffer the consequences, and certainly, if unrepented of, suffer eternal consequences. I want to point out just a few things. We're getting close to drawing our lesson to a close, but the question may come up sometimes about testing versus tempting. God testing people versus Satan tempting people. And I want to point out just a few things here, especially as it in regards to God's testing and as it pertains to trials. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 and 7 says, "In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ." You know, it wasn't easy for the people to travel through the wilderness, to go through all of the trials that they went through, or even the 400 years that they spent under bondage in Egypt. But those were trials that they went through, and we as Christians go through various trials today as well. And ultimately, if we view them from the proper perspective, and if we approach them from the knowledge that God's going to give us the strength we need, then they'll ultimately lead to our benefit. James 1, verses 2 through 4, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." Again, these trials are going to lead us to becoming a more perfect and complete Christian and servant to our Heavenly Father. And I think one of the greatest stories of testing is the story of Job. And we talked about that in our recent study over strong weaknesses. But in Job 23 and 10, there Job says, "But he," that is God, "knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold." Ultimately, if we have the devotion and the confidence, the devotion to God and the confidence that we need to have in Him, no matter what we go through, we're going to come out as being gold in His sight. And I like this quote from Seneca. It says, a gem cannot be polished without great friction, nor a man perfected without trials. A lot of times we try to avoid the challenges in life. We try to navigate around some of the tough things that may happen. But ultimately, if we realize that they're going to lead to our benefit and lead to our perfection over time, then that's something we can take a lot of great confidence in. Now I want to point out just one passage as far as Satan's tempting goes. And this is a familiar passage certainly to all of us, but James chapter 1, verses 12 through 15. Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. You know, we don't need to confuse the two, Satan's tempting and God's testing. God's not the one that's tempting us, it's Satan himself, and we need to not lose sight of that. And when we fall victim to temptation, it's not God who's led us there, it's our own evil desires that have taken us there, and also the challenge that Satan throws before us. And I want to throw up just a few points to make as far as God's testing and Satan's tempting, and just make a few applications to each. But first of all, God's testing, it reinforces God's commands. Each and every time when we go through testing, or each and every time when Israel went through testing, it was to reinforce what God had commanded them to do in the first place. But when Satan tempts, it undercuts God's commands. Think all the way back to the Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve telling the serpent that it was God's command to not do that. Well, he immediately undercuts God's command there and says that as soon as you eat of the fruit, you're not going to die. That's not going to happen. So he ultimately undercuts and discredits God's commands. Also, what happens with God's testing is that it elevates God's wisdom and power. He shows time and again to the children of Israel, they're hard learners. And so are we. We're difficult to sometimes catch the lesson, I think. But ultimately, when God tests, it elevates his wisdom and his power to the children of Israel. But when Satan tempts, he does it in an effort to elevate man's wisdom and man's power in order to try to steer man away from God's commands. And obviously, God's testing is meant for man's benefit, but Satan's tempting is meant for man's destruction. You know, when we think about what does Satan have to look forward to, he's already been defeated. He has nothing ahead of him. And so the only thing that he has to look forward to is that misery loves company, and he's wanting to take as many people as he can with us. And so anything that he tries to do, any snare that he throws along our way, it's meant for our own destruction. So I wanted to point that out as far as comparing testing and tempting. And that's all that I have for us this evening. I hope it's been helpful as we kind of looked at a lot of the book of Numbers. And of course, as we progress through, we'll see them entering into Canaan and the conquest that takes place there. But we see them begin to get a little bit of momentum as they begin to follow God's commands. And what we see recorded throughout the rest of the Old Testament is Israel continually going through that cycle of disobeying God and being punished for it, and then following God's commands and being blessed for it. And so we see that cycle continue. But want to now extend the invitation. If there's one here who's never obeyed the gospel, we certainly want to encourage you to take those steps at this time and become a Christian. Or if there is one here who has taken those steps but needs to make some wrong right, please come as we stand and sing.